friends. I'm Ursula Bielski, and this is Uncanny Catholic. And I am so happy that you're here with me, whether you are a Catholic, another Christian denomination, or another religion, or nothing at all, because we can all appreciate the uncanny. Am I right? Today, I want to talk to you about a very interesting story. I'm from Chicago, born and raised. I've written a lot of books about haunted Chicago. And probably our most famous ghost story here in Chicago is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker or phantom hitchhiker known as Resurrection Mary, who hitchhikes up and down Archer Avenue on the south side of Chicago. This story you've probably heard a million times if you're into ghost stories. And there are versions of vanishing hitchhikers like Mary that are told all over the world. But what's fascinating is that right here in Chicago, we have several other vanishing hitchhikers. We have the Klein Avenue Ghost in Gary, Indiana, which is right over the border from Chicago into Indiana. That's often associated with the steel mills in Gary, Indiana. We have the World's Fair Ghost in Chicago, this young woman that was picked up by travelers to the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago, the Century of Progress exposition. And she was known to get into people's cars and then predict the days that they would die, the dates that they would die. It's not a very good traveling companion. Don't pick up hitchhikers. But so we have a lot of different hitchhikers here in Chicago. We've got the Forest Park Flapper that's been seen on Des Plaines Avenue near Forest Park Cemetery. But a story that I've heard since I was little is the story of all people, Catholic Saint Frances Cabrini. As you may know, Frances Cabrini spent a lot of time here in Chicago. She founded so many hospitals and orphanages all around the United States, and including right here in Chicago. And there is a very famous ghost story here in Chicago that I'm going to share with you that many people connect to St. Frances Cabrini appearing to people after death. Let's look into this story. The story goes back to the earliest days of Chicago's so-called Bloody Maxwell Police District. This is on the near west side of Chicago, and this was a place that was the place where all of the immigrants came into Chicago in the late 19th century. So there were little different neighborhoods all over the near west side. There was Greektown, Little Italy, and so forth, and Maxwell Street, which was the old Jewish ghetto where the immigrants were all coming in. And Bloody Maxwell, they called it because it was one of the most deadly police districts in the country at that time. There was like a murder a day in the Maxwell Street district. It was a place that had a lot of criminal activity going on, of course. And again, it all dates back to the late 19th century. The woman in this story, this female phantom in this story, we know that she dates back to that time because she is always seen wearing late 19th century Victorian clothing, particularly a long black dress and usually a black veil over her hair. Now, I was first introduced to this story when I was a teenager because I had heard from my dad's old police friends. He was a police officer and he worked at the Maxwell Street District for a while. When I was a kid, we would visit there, and the watch commander would talk about the ghosts that they would hear in the old lockup that was in the basement. They would hear wailing and crying and screaming coming from where the old lockup had been in the basement, which was a very notorious lockup. Let's just put it that way. But my dad had told a story of this harrowing rescue of a motorcyclist that had occurred on the Dan Ryan Expressway in the Maxwell Street area. Had been thrown from his bike and he was lying near death by the side of the expressway when a woman wearing a 19th century jet black dress with a black covering around her face appeared beside him, and she knelt down next to him and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, and she was praying over him. As soon as those paramedics arrived, she vanished into thin air, and the young man was asking, "Where is she? Where's that lady? Where's that lady that stayed with me?" And no one had seen a lady. Paramedics later testified that the man had told the story to them upon their arrival, but that no woman was seen by the first responders on that scene. So this was a story that was being told in the 1970s around Chicago by police officers who had heard the story from the first responders on that scene. His injuries, which he was not expected to survive, quickly healed, amazing the doctors who attended to him in the weeks that followed. Now, in later years, after I'd gotten much further into ghosts and hauntings, I was surprised when the television program Unsolved Mysteries featured the story of a man named Robert Davidson, a motorcyclist who was struck by lightning in June of 1980 while pulled over during a storm on the interstate near Acton, Indiana. So this was several years after the encounter in Chicago. Davidson instantly fell to the ground dead, smoke pouring from the wound made by the bolt of lightning. Paramedics were called and they tried to revive the man, but they could not coax a heartbeat from his frame. And then something truly strange happened. The paramedics reported that their ambulance went dead, all of their equipment fizzled into darkness and silence, and at the same time, motorists who had stopped to aid the victim claimed that a chill had ripped through their bodies. Then a stranger appeared from out of nowhere, and they all described her as a small woman dressed in black clothing of antiquity with black flowing hair framing her face. The woman cried out, "I must touch him," and pushed through the crowd of people with her arm outstretched. She had a silver crucifix around her neck, and she wore high-buttoned shoes and had a Bible in her hand. The woman knelt down beside the man, and she recited the 23rd Psalm, which begins, of course, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The onlookers noticed that in the pouring rain during the storm, her clothing wasn't getting wet. After finishing the prayer, the woman smiled at the paramedics and vanished into the crowd. She was never seen again. At once, the ambulance equipment blared to life again, and Davidson opened up his eyes. Later, many at the scene, including one of the paramedics, claimed that they had seen no woman there, just like during the encounter back in Chicago. Other stories have surfaced over the years with reports of aid from a mysterious lady in black or woman in black told by residents and passersby through Chicago's near West Side Italian neighborhoods. One man spoke of being suicidal in the 1970s after losing his job and his wife filing for divorce. This was a story that I personally collected during my years of research here in Chicago. He had gone to a park near the University of Illinois on the near west side with the intention of slitting his wrists. He was sitting next to a tree sometime after midnight when a woman appeared, standing next to him, dressed in black, with a black, what he called a habit, like a nun's habit, around her face and a crucifix around her neck. He said with some ferocity, "Go home." The man had attended Catholic schools, and he was conditioned to obey the nuns who had taught him, and he recognized this woman as a nun, so he did what he was told. He got up and said he went home, and he told his family about the woman that had admonished him in the park. His wife's face, which had been angry and hard when he appeared at the door, softened as she listened, and she was deeply moved by this story and agreed to continue to work on saving their marriage, which they did reportedly. Now, this is another story that was told to me when I first started writing about Chicago ghosts. So this story I collected probably 30 years ago. And it was told to me by a man who had been a Chicago police recruit in the late 1960s. He said he encountered this mysterious woman inside a local diner not far from the expressway where the motorcyclist would meet his own mysterious stranger some years later. And this gentleman told me that this experience always stayed with him throughout his life. And these are his words. "I was 20 years old. I was enrolled in the Chicago Police Academy, which was located near Maxwell Street and the Dan Ryan Expressway. I had been attending the academy for several months and was taking lunch with two other academy students. As we entered a small restaurant in this area, I remember a white lady dressed in all black clothes. Her dress reminded me of someone from the 1800s, and the reason I mentioned her color is because the area was basically a black neighborhood, and seeing a white lady in this area made this individual encounter even stranger. Now, as I stood in the entryway to the restaurant with my friends on either side of me, this lady in black came up to me and looked right into my eyes. Without a word or hand gesture or even a facial expression, she somehow communicated to me to hand her the pen and small notepad I had in my upper left hand shirt pocket. I did just that without knowing exactly why. She took the pen and notepad and wrote something onto the notepad. Then she looked at me and shook her head in a gesture of no. She handed me the pen and pad and left abruptly. End quote. I looked onto the notepad and noticed what she had written: my name and my birth date. Then I also realized that it was in my own handwriting. I quickly turned to my friends and asked them, "Did you see what that lady just did?" They responded to my question as though I was crazy. What lady? They acted as if nothing unusual happened, and we went into the restaurant and had lunch. This strange little encounter stayed with me, and because of it, I always felt that I would have to quit the Chicago Police Department someday. I felt that she was telling me to leave this career in order to save my life. Happily, this young recruit stayed out of the way of danger, but he had many close calls, and he never forgot, each time one occurred, what the mysterious lady in black had done and what she had seemed to know about the direction his career would take. I have come to believe myself that encounters with this mysterious lady in black of the near West Side may have their origins in the story of Chicago's real life saint, the Italian American woman named Frances Xavier Cabrini. Now, a little bit about Frances Cabrini, if you don't know about her life. She was sent to the United States in 1889 from Italy to minister to the swelling immigrant population in New York City. She went on to establish more than 60 institutions, including hospitals, schools, and children's homes across the Americas. Mother Cabrini became the first U.S. citizen to be canonized, made into a saint. Or declared a saint. She is the patron saint of immigrants as well. A great deal of Carini's work happened in Chicago, with her base of operations at Columbus Hospital in Lincoln Park, where my husband was born, where she also lived. Upon her death at the hospital just before Christmas in 1917, penitents began to travel to the hospital to visit her former room and to pray there, and a national shrine was erected at the site in 1955. Though the hospital was demolished in recent years, the saint's former room was dismantled and rebuilt as an annex to the shrine, which still stands today. And there are high-end condos. This overlooks Lincoln Park. There are high-end condos that were built all around her room and the shrine, so it's pretty cool. Now, there is a famous ghost story here in Chicago. This is one that was first told, many years ago. In fact, I think I heard this story at first from my dad, also when he was a police officer when I was a kid. So it's this famous story about this little nun. One night, some 20 years after Mother Caprini's death, a torrential rain was beating down on Chicago when a cab driver, peering through his windshield, saw an elderly nun clothed in black making her way along the street. He rolled down his window and invited her to get into his cab for a ride home. She did. The woman said that she was going to Columbus Hospital in Lincoln Park, where she lived with the other sisters of her order. The night was dark, and the driver could barely see through the windshield, but he followed her directions and soon pulled up to the corner of Columbus Hospital. They were far from the destination and began to talk. At the beginning of the ride, they were far from the destination and began to talk at length, and they talked about current events, the Ohio River flood, the Spanish Civil War. They talked about the First World War, and then the nun said something that the cab driver would never forget. Soon, she said, another war would come, far worse than this one. Atrocities of that war would eclipse anything mankind had ever seen. America would be attacked on its own soil by vicious enemies different from any they had fought before. Prayer, she said, was of the utmost importance, as was charity to all who would suffer in the terrible days to come. The driver thought little of the conversation. He thought that she was like an old world, old school lady from Italy that had some with making crazy prophecies. But they finally arrived at the hospital. The nun looked at the man and said goodnight, got out of the car, and disappeared behind the large oak door of the building. The driver pulled away and soon picked up another rider in the rain. But when the passenger got in, he exclaimed, "Oh, sorry, I almost sat on your Bible. You better keep that dry up next to you." And so he hands this Bible to the driver, and the cab driver says, "Oh, I had a nun in here before you. She must have left it." So the man takes this worn Bible, tattered with years of reading, and he puts it on the seat next to him. And after he drops off his new fare, he goes back to Columbus Hospital to return the Bible. He double parks his cab and goes up through the rain to the door, and he knocks loudly on this big oak door. And in a minute, a young woman answers, a novice, smiling at him. "May I help you?" she asks. "Visiting hours are over. Is there something that you need?" So the cab driver says, "No, I'm not visiting. I just wanted to return this. I drove home your mother superior this evening and she left this in my cab." And he holds out the Bible. The young girl looks at it and then she just bursts out laughing. She says, "I see. She certainly is forgetful even after death." The cab driver looks at this girl like, Say what?" And in answer, the girl swings open this large, heavy door to reveal the interior lobby of the building. And there in the dim entrance hall is this huge illuminated painting, a portrait of this little nun that was in the back of the cab. She says to the cab driver, "Is that the woman you drove here?" And the cab driver says, "That's her." She says, "That's our mother, Cabrini. She founded this hospital, and she's dead," basically. So this is a version of the story that I've always heard, and this is pure, like, Chicago folklore, right? Like, I've never been able to track down, like, a newspaper article about this or any firsthand account of it. It's always pure folklore, like, second, third hand, right? But then, very recently, I found the work of a folklorist at the University of Chicago that was working way back in the 1940s named Archer Taylor. And I discovered that a lot of our folklore in Chicago dates back to the work that he did, including the first stories of vanishing hitchhikers in Chicago. So this is one of the stories that Archer Taylor collected, and this is dated Chicago, Illinois, 1941. This mysterious story went the rounds here last winter, and he collected this from someone in Chicago. This mysterious story went the rounds here last winter, and I first heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend in Chicago who had heard it from her neighbor. Typical folklore, right? Mike, a cab driver, tells the story of a mysterious fair he had in early December. Cruising on a street in downtown Chicago, he picked up an elderly sister of some Catholic order and was told to take her to X Street. He had his radio on and they talked about Pearl Harbor for a while. She said it won't last more than 4 months. Okay. So this was after Pearl Harbor, many years after the story that I grew up hearing. Then they drove on, and Mike drew up at the address. Jumping out to open the cab door, he was surprised to find no one there in the cab. Afraid that the little lady had jumped her fare, he hastened to inquire at the address she had given, which they'd arrived at. It was a convent, and when questioned by the superior in charge, Mike told of the sister who had disappeared and hadn't paid her fare. "What did she look like?" the superior asked, and explained that no sister from the convent had been downtown that day. As Mike described her, he happened to look at a picture hanging on the wall behind the superior's desk. "That's her." he said, pointing to the picture. And he thought to himself that he would get the fare after all, right? But the Mother Superior smiled quietly and said, "She has been dead for 10 years." Saint Frances Cabrini was a spiritually powerful woman who doubtless is still ministering here on earth. And I think still encouraging prayer and still encouraging charity as she did so much in life. And maybe that intercession has traveled far beyond Chicago to places like that storm-riddled roadside in Indiana in 1980 and the side of Robert Davidson, who actually seemed to have come back to life after her prayerful intercession for him. So this story continues to be told, although not very frequently, around Chicago, and I'm still on the lookout for people who heard a firsthand account of this story because it was very influential on me when I started out at first writing about the ghosts of Chicago and was amazed to find that we had far more than just one vanishing hitchhiker, far more than just Resurrection Mary. Not just Resurrection Mary, but so the story of the Lady in Black of Chicago, could she be Saint Frances Cabrini, who did so much good work here in Chicago and all over North and South America? I think so. Thanks so much for being here with me today. This has been Uncanny Catholic. If you could please be a darling, wonderful friend and like this video, comment something below. Let me know what you think of it. Subscribe to the channel and share this with your friends. It really helps YouTube to show these videos to more people. I'm Ursula Bielski. Until next time, remember to pray for ghosts. Take care.